In this video, I'm going to talk about the play called Salome by Oscar Wilde. Wilde was an Irish writer who lived in the second half of the 19th century, from 1854 to 1900. He spent quite a lot of time between England and France as well, and became associated with the schools of literary decadence and aestheticism in the English language. He went to Oxford University, where he studied with Walter Pater, who I mentioned in the previous video, and who was a major writer in the aestheticist movement. Wilde was homosexual. In the late 19th century, it was illegal to be homosexual, so Wilde, at the height of his career, in 1895, was put on trial and eventually sentenced to prison, where he spent 2 years serving hard labor, and then he spent the remainder of his life living in France in exile. Wilde is buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Inscribed on the back of his tomb is a description of him, which begins with the words, "Oscar Wilde, author of Salome and other beautiful works." Probably Wilde is most famous for his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, but as you can tell from the mention of Salome on the back of his tomb, this play, Salome, was also quite important and quite influential on his part. This text shares a lot of themes with texts that I talked about in the last couple of videos. Themes like corruption, pleasure and desire, hedonism, sensuality, luxury, an emphasis on surfaces that lack value beneath them. So you might think of The Counterfeit Money by Baudelaire. Wilde originally wrote the play in French in the early 1890s and then ended up translating it into English himself as well. Salome was a famously salacious and shocking and scandalous play, and was in fact banned in England all the way up until 1931. It made its world premiere in Paris in 1896, but it wasn't staged in the English-speaking world until the 20th century. I want to cite what I think is a quite good summary of what Salome is about from a book called Salome's Modernity by Petra Dierkes-Thrun, which I'll come back to a couple times during this video. She writes, "Salome finds a way out of the misery of pitiful modern humanity by fearlessly establishing her own rules and committing to the beauty of immanence and the violence of the human struggle, rather than seeking metaphysical transcendence." So this encapsulates a lot of what Salome is about. The character Salome is fiercely committed to her own desire and her own desire for beauty. So in addition to some of the themes that I mentioned previously, Salome offers also a pretty profound meditation on the relationship of beauty and desire with violence, and it dramatizes the relationship between immanence and transcendence, and also between horror and fascination. We'll come back to these questions in a few minutes, but first I want to give you a sense of the history of Salome, not just Wilde's Salome, but the history of the story of Salome in general, which goes quite far back. As you may know, the story of Salome originates in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. I'll read real quick the story of Salome as it's recounted in the Gospel of Mark in the New International Version of the Bible. So this is from Mark chapter 6, starting on verse 21 through verse 28. It reads, "Finally the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. The king said to the girl, 'Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you.' And he promised her with an oath, 'Whatever you ask, I will give you up to half my kingdom.' She went out and said to her mother, 'What shall I ask for?' 'The head of John the Baptist,' she answered. At once the girl hurried in to the king with the request, 'I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter.' The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother." So that's the story in the Bible. It describes Herod Antipas, who was the ruler of Galilee and Perea, which at the time were subsidiary states of the Roman Empire. So Herod's sort of like what a governor would be in the United States, although it's not quite the same thing. And he had just taken Herodias as his wife, who was previously the wife of his brother. And then Herodias has a daughter who is not named in the Bible. The name Salome isn't given to her until late in the 1st century of the current era by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. And then there's the character of John the Baptist, who is sometimes called the forerunner because he was the person who came to announce the coming of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. He's called John the Baptist because he was the person who baptized Jesus. In this story, though, Herod has captured John the Baptist after John the Baptist has gone around condemning him and his wife Herodias for being in an unlawful marriage. Because of these condemnations, Herodias really doesn't like John the Baptist, although Herod is a little bit afraid of him. So Herodias wants him dead, but Herod is hesitant and wants to keep him alive. And in the story, Herod has this kind of weird attraction to Herodias' daughter, who ends up dancing for him and pleasing him, and he offers to give her anything she wants, up to half of his entire kingdom. In the Bible, Salome doesn't know what she wants. She goes and asks her mother, and her mother sees this as a great opportunity to get John the Baptist executed, so she has Salome ask for his head on a platter, and Herod reluctantly agrees and executes John the Baptist. So this is a story about John the Baptist's death. It's also a story about seduction and desire, about marriage, and about politics. So the story of Salome begins in the Bible, but over the years it becomes a really prominent and recurring theme in art. So for instance, the figure of Salome appears in the stained glass of certain cathedrals in Europe. Salome is also an important figure in painting, especially in Renaissance painting. So you get Salome and John the Baptist becoming major subjects for artists like Caravaggio, Titian, Andrea Solario, Da Vinci, Raphael, and many others. And then the figure of Salome comes back in the 19th century in a big way, in painting as well as in literature. So you get painters like Gustave Moreau and illustrators like Aubrey Beardsley, who illustrated the original version of Wilde's play, and you saw some of his illustrations in the version of the play that you read. The figure of Salome also becomes thematized in 19th century writing. So there's a short story by Gustave Flaubert, a poem by Heinrich Heine, a poem by Stéphane Mallarmé, a poem by Arthur Symonds, and the figure of Salome also reappears in works by Jules Laforgue and Joris Karl Huysmans. These are all literary precursors to Wilde's play, many of which influenced it directly, especially Mallarmé, Flaubert, and Huysmans. These 19th century versions of Salome portray her famously as what's called a femme fatale, which is an archetype described in the Oxford English Dictionary as an attractive and seductive woman, especially one who is likely to cause risk to or the downfall of anyone who becomes involved with her. This archetype appears across many traditions, including the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Hindu tradition, in ancient Greece, in ancient China, in ancient Egypt, and so on. In the 19th century, this figure or this archetype becomes really popular. Salome is one example, a really famous example, but there are others. For instance, Ligeia by Poe, or the opera Carmen by Georges Bizet. And this archetype has persisted into the 20th and 21st century, especially in film and television. So it appears a lot in film noir in the mid-20th century, also in James Bond movies shortly thereafter. There's versions of it in Blade Runner. There's a 2002 film that's literally just called Femme Fatale, starring Antonio Banderas. And then there's more contemporary examples in, for instance, the character of Alex Voss in Orange is the New Black. Another contemporary example might be the character of Melisandre in Game of Thrones. In general, the figure of the femme fatale kind of just ends up being placed there in the story to threaten the protagonist, but ultimately to be defeated, to restore order and control in the face of her seduction and her sowing of chaos. In her book Salome's Modernity, Petra Dirkes-Thrun argues that Salome challenges this traditional role of the femme fatale, or alters it. So she writes, unlike typical femme fatale stories ending with the defeat of the female evildoer and providing satisfying resurrections of human mastery over an otherwise uncontrollable and angst-inducing modern fate, Salome does not offer a reassuring reordering of the moral universe and restored sense of safety and comfort. The end remains unsettlingly sudden, ambiguous, and open. The abrupt royal execution exacerbates rather than solves the question, Does Salome lose, or does she triumph? So this is one kind of interesting take on the way that Wilde's play calls into question the more traditional figure of the femme fatale as it had been deployed in the 19th century. These 19th century versions of the story of Salome, Wilde's especially, have often also been taken up in the performing arts, in music and dance, and then also in film. So for instance, before Wilde's play, the French composer Jules Massenet had taken up this story of Salome as a subject for an opera. And then again, at the beginning of the 20th century, actually Wilde's play itself was taken up as the libretto for an opera by the German composer Richard Strauss. There have been ballets, for instance, by Paul Hindemith and Martha Graham. There's another one by Maud Allen, both in the early 20th century. And there are also quite a few films that take up this story. So for instance, there's this 1922 version of Salome by Alla Nazimova called Salome, an Historical Fantasy by Oscar Wilde, which has entered the public domain. And so I'm using clips from this film throughout this video to give you a sense of the aesthetic of this play. I think this film in particular does a very good job of capturing the kind of excessive, luxurious, campy style that the play is often staged in. The figure of Salome also appears in the movie Sunset Boulevard in 1950, as well as a 1994 movie called A Man of No Importance by Suri Krishnama. In 1972, the Italian director Carmelo Bene made a really interesting cinematic interpretation of the story of Salome. And then more recently, in 2011, Al Pacino directed and starred in a version of the story called Wild Salome, where Salome is played by Jessica Chastain. So the story of Salome has been told and retold many times. These are really just a few examples of them. And you see it appears in every kind of art, from painting to movies to books and plays and dances and operas and everything. And so this is a really culturally pervasive story. And Wilde's play constitutes a really important moment in the retelling of this story. It really changes the way in which it gets told afterwards. If you're interested in doing any research on the story of Salome, there are a few pieces that I would recommend here. I've already mentioned one, which is Salome's Modernity, Oscar Wilde and the Aesthetics of Transgression by Petra Dirkes-Thrun. Another one would be Salome and the Dance of Writing, Portraits of Mimesis in Literature by Françoise Meltzer. And then a well-known French philosopher named René Girard has an interesting essay about the figure of Salome in the Bible, called Scandal and the Dance, Salome in the Gospel of Mark. So those are a few places that I'd recommend you start if you're interested in reading more about the story of Salome in general. But let's now talk about the play itself. I won't spend much time rehashing the plot, but you'll remember some of the major points are that Herod has John the Baptist locked in a cistern, which is kind of like a well. John the Baptist in this version, in Wilde's version of the story, is named Yochanan, but that's the same person as John the Baptist. And then Herod's having a party. Salome leaves the party and comes and discovers Yochanan locked in the well. She then has him brought out and falls in love with him on the spot. He, being a religious man, rejects her advances, and she vows that she will have him anyway. Then she goes and does her famous dance, which Oscar Wilde names the Dance of the Seven Veils. So she does the Dance of the Seven Veils for Herod, and he, just like in the story of the Bible, promises to give her anything up to half of his kingdom. And she, like in the Bible again, demands Yochanan's head. Then the head is presented to her on a silver platter or a silver charger. And at the end of the story, Wilde adds his own perverse twist on the Salome narrative by having Salome finally kiss the lips of the severed head of John the Baptist, which she promised to do earlier in the story. At the very end of the play, upon seeing this perverse and necrophilic act, Herod orders his guards to kill Salome, and they rush up to her and crush her beneath their shields. And that's how the play ends. So what I'd like to discuss about the play is some of its recurring and important themes. The first of these is the association of visuality with destructiveness. So in other words, for Wilde, sight is a destructive force in the play. You can see this association of sight and destruction, or at least the threat of destruction, in lines like, "You must not look at her, you look at her too much." And then elsewhere, "What is that to you? Why do you look at her? You must not look at her. Something terrible may happen." And then, "Do not look at her. I pray you not to look at her." And then you get the character Yochanan recognizing the potential destructiveness of Salome looking at him when he says things like, "Who is this woman who is looking at me? I will not have her look at me. Wherefore doth she look at me with her golden eyes under her gilded eyelids? I know not who she is. I do not wish to know who she is. Bid her be gone. It is not to her that I would speak." So many people read this particular theme in relationship to the idea of the male gaze, which is defined as a manner of treating women's bodies as objects to be surveyed. In other words, it's the presentation of women in art and literature as objects of desire and seduction. In Wilde's play, this is represented by Herod's gaze constantly being fixed upon Salome. You'll remember that he's constantly looking at her and constantly being admonished by his wife Herodias for looking at her too much. Ultimately, by kind of turning Herod's male gaze against him, Salome ends up usurping his power and getting him to do her will. Then, of course, there's the gaze of Salome herself, which fixes upon John the Baptist, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And that obviously ends tragically as well with both of their deaths. Within this broader thematic association of visuality and destructiveness, there is also the figure of the moon, which is important for Wilde's play. The moon kind of comes to double Salome herself, and so you see them being described very similarly at different times. So for instance, toward the beginning, the page of Herodias says, "Look at the moon, how strange the moon seems. She is like a woman rising from a tomb. She is like a dead woman. You would fancy she was looking for dead things." To which the young Syrian responds, "She has a strange look. She is like a little princess who wears a yellow veil, and whose feet are of silver. She is like a princess who has little white doves for feet. You would fancy she was dancing." And then the page of Herodias says, "She is like a woman who is dead. She moves very slowly." So the moon is described as a princess, as a little flower, as veiled, and all of these things also come to characterize Salome elsewhere in the play. So for instance, later the young Syrian, whose name is also Nerebath, says, "How pale the princess is. Never have I seen her so pale. She is like the shadow of a white rose in a mirror of silver." So here you have Salome being described as pale, like the moon, the shadow of a white rose in a mirror of silver, emphasizing the fact of the moon being a reflecting surface itself, something that reflects the sun's light. And you have a repetition of the color silver here, as both a description of the moon earlier and now as a description of Salome herself. Elsewhere, the page of Herodias describes the moon saying, "Oh, how strange the moon looks. You would think it was the hand of a dead woman who is seeking to cover herself with a shroud." So here the moon is associated with death, and the deaths that will come later in the story. Then Salome herself describes the moon. She says, "How good to see the moon. She is like a little piece of money. You would think she was a little silver flower. The moon is cold and chaste. I am sure she is a virgin. She has a virgin's beauty. Yes, she is a virgin. She has never defiled herself. She has never abandoned herself to men like the other goddesses." Here the moon becomes a symbol for purity, which also reflects Salome's purity at this point in the story, which, of course, as you know, doesn't last by the end of it. And then Herod describes the moon. He says, "The moon has a strange look tonight. Has she not a strange look? She is like a mad woman who is seeking everywhere for lovers. She is naked too. She is quite naked. The clouds are seeking to clothe her nakedness, but she will not let them. She shows herself naked in the sky. She reels through the clouds like a drunken woman. I am sure she is looking for lovers. Does she not reel like a drunken woman? She is like a mad woman, is she not?" So for Herod, the moon is a figure of madness and desire and loss of control, much like Salome is for him. So throughout the play, the figure of the moon comes to stand in as a kind of objective correlative for Salome's psychological or emotional state, or the broader themes of desire, seduction, and violence that permeate the play more generally. As the character of Salome progresses through different stages of purity and innocence at first, and then desire, and then violence and transgression at the end, so does the moon also progress through different stages. And this is represented in the figure of the moon in its transition from being white to being red or a blood moon, to ultimately becoming covered with clouds and the sky becoming black. So the play moves in a progression from white to red to black. from purity to desire to death. This progression is described in Salome's Modernity in the following way. Throughout the play, Salome's and the moon's symbolic intertwinement functions as a structural device that foretells impending turns of events via three phases, white, red, and black, by slowly moving the plot toward its inevitable fatal conclusion, the escalation into violence and murder. So the broader themes of visuality in the play are represented in the figure of Herod's and Salome's gazes, in the moon as a kind of mirror of Salome, and finally in the colors that the moon and Salome move throughout the play. The next set of themes to talk about in Salome are the religious ones, and the way that questions of religion and prophecy are perpetually misrecognized. So remember, this play is set in a time before Christianity, and in a place where the two major competing religions are Judaism and the pagan Roman gods. And all of a sudden, the figure of Yochanan, or John the Baptist, shows up to announce the coming of the Messiah. And like many prophecies, his words appear to them to be mysterious. So for instance, as the character of the first soldier describes, sometimes he says terrible things, but it is impossible to understand what he says. And then later in the play, when the characters called the Nazarenes are having a discussion of religion and the coming of Christ and the existence of angels, Herodias says, "These men are mad. They have looked too long on the moon." There's the moon again. "Command them to be silent." And then finally, you have the most important misrecognition in the play, where Salome is just not interested at all in John the Baptist's words, his prophecies. She's only interested in his voice and his beauty. As it's put in Salome's Modernity, she is simply not interested in the metaphysical contents he preaches, only in his sensual appeal. So at one point in the play, for instance, you get Yochanan rebuking Salome as a kind of immoral figure, the daughter of a sinner. He says, "Back, daughter of Babylon, come not near the chosen of the Lord. Thy mother hath filled the earth with the wine of her iniquities, and the cry of her sins hath come up to the ears of God." So it's this very holy reproach, and Salome responds by simply saying, "Speak again, Yochanan, thy voice is wine to me." So in other words, he says, "You're a sinner, you're impure, get away from me, I'm holy." And all she says is, "You have such a pretty voice." And then later he announces the coming of Christ, who he describes as the Son of Man. And all Salome says is, "Who is he, the Son of Man? Is he as beautiful as thou art, Yochanan?" And then along the same lines, you get this really important scene where Salome is professing her desire for Yochanan, for John the Baptist. And it also moves through the same phases of white, red, and black, although in a slightly different order. Salome says, "Yochanan, I am amorous of thy body. Thy body is white like the lilies of a field that the mower hath never mowed. Thy body is white like the snows that lie on the mountains, like the snows that lie on the mountains of Judea, and come down into the valleys. The roses in the garden of the Queen of Arabia are not so white as thy body. Neither the roses in the garden of the Queen of Arabia, the perfumed garden of spices of the Queen of Arabia, nor the feet of the dawn when they light on the leaves, nor the breast of the moon when she lies on the breast of the sea. There is nothing in the world so white as thy body. Let me touch thy body." And Yochanan rebukes her, as before. He says, "Back, daughter of Babylon, by woman came evil into the world. Speak not to me, I will not listen to thee. I listen but to the voice of the Lord God." So she just finished proclaiming her love for his body, and as soon as he rejects her, she changes her mind completely. She says, "Thy body is hideous. It is like the body of a leper. It is like a plastered wall where vipers have crawled, like a plastered wall where the scorpions have made their nest. It is like a whitened sepulchre full of loathsome things. It is horrible. Thy body is horrible." And then she says, "It is of thy hair that I am enamored, Yochanan." And then she goes on to describe his hair as being black as night, as black as dark forests. She says, "There is nothing in the world so black as thy hair. Let me touch thy hair." And he says no, again. He says, "Back, daughter of Sodom, touch me not. Profane not the temple of the Lord God." And again, Salome completely changes her position after being rejected, saying, "It's not actually your hair that I like. Your hair is very ugly. It's your mouth. It's your mouth that I want." So she says, "Thy hair is horrible. It's covered with mire and dust. It is like a crown of thorns which they have placed on thy forehead. It is like a knot of black serpents writhing round thy neck. I love not thy hair. It is thy mouth that I desire, Yochanan. Thy mouth is redder than the feet of those who tread the wine in the winepress. Thy mouth is redder than the feet of the doves who haunt the temples and are fed by the priests. It is redder than the feet of him who cometh from a forest where he hath slain a lion and seen gilded tigers. Thy mouth is like a branch of coral that fishers have found in the twilight of the sea, the coral that they keep for the kings. And ultimately she says, there is nothing in the world so red as thy mouth. Let me kiss thy mouth. So again, Yochanan is going around telling prophecies of the coming of Jesus and of religious salvation and all of those sorts of things. And his message falls flat with Salome, who only sees his surface, who only sees his body and sees him as beautiful. So in other words, Wilde here is having Salome heretically and ironically misrecognize the importance of Yochanan. Instead of being a religious prophet, he's just an object of beauty or an object of desire. The last major theme to discuss is the relationship that Wilde portrays between desire and destruction. If we were doing a psychoanalytic reading of this story, we might talk about this theme in terms of Freud's idea that he called the death drive. But we're not going to do that. Instead, I'll just talk really briefly about Herod's desire and Salome's desire. Both end up leading to their destruction in different ways. So first, Herod's desire. He's constantly looking at Salome in the play in this kind of creepy, quasi-incestuous sort of way, embodying the male gaze and so on. And ultimately, his desire is to see Salome dance. And in order to do that, he ends up offering up to half his kingdom. So he offers her all of these various luxurious items, all these very decadent items, such as the biggest emerald in the world, for instance, and many other types of gems, a bunch of white peacocks to follow her around, a fan made of parrot's feathers, a crystal, and finally a thing called the Veil of the Sanctuary, which probably refers to a novel by Flaubert called Salammbô. But the idea is that Herod becomes so overcome by his desire, that he ends up ceding his power to Salome. In other words, Salome ends up usurping his power by dancing for him, by using his desire against him, and ultimately getting him to do the one thing he really didn't want to do, which was behead this prophet who he's sort of afraid of. There's this scene where Herod is basically all but on his hands and his knees begging Salome to give her anything else but John the Baptist's head. He'll do anything else but behead John the Baptist. And so she gets him to offer all these things to her. And so she ends up kind of having a complete control over Herod, who is supposed to be the ruler. So his desire ends up leading to his powerlessness. And then, of course, there's Salome's desire herself. She's overcome with a desire for Yochanan, for his beauty. So it's this kind of sexual desire and a desire for beauty and pleasure. And this desire so overwhelms her that when Yochanan rejects her advances, she'll go to any extreme to fulfill her desire. So ultimately, of course, she ends up killing John the Baptist and fulfills her promise to kiss his lips. Right before she does so, importantly, Herod says, "I will not look at things, I will not suffer things to look at me. Put out the torches, hide the moon, hide the stars, let us hide ourselves in our palace, Herodias. I begin to be afraid." So here the lights go out, all sight, all visuality is lost, and this is the moment when Salome kisses the severed head of John the Baptist. So at this point you kind of have a lot of the play's themes coming together at its end. Herod puts out the lights, but then a single moonbeam falls upon Salome, and he sees the sort of hideous achievement of her desire and sends his soldiers to kill her. So these are just a few of the major themes and figures that recur in Wilde's play Salome. There are certainly plenty of other ones that we could look at in terms of the corruption and transgression of moral, political, sexual, or religious orders. But hopefully this is enough to get you started thinking about this play, for you to see its complexity and its relevance and its history, and some of its themes and subject matter. But that's going to be it for this unit on decadence and late 19th century literature. Next week we'll begin reading texts written in the 20th century. Please make sure you do the writing assignment posted in iCollege about Salome. That will be due on Tuesday. And also I hope you're continuing to work on your final paper. Let me know if you have any questions about this text or about the written assignments, and I hope you're all doing well.